Welcome to Latinas from the Block to the Boardroom, where wisdom comes from everywhere. This is a podcast about generational wisdom shared to help build a bridge for future generations and to build stronger communities through education, technology, and health. Welcome to Latinas from the Block to the Boardroom. Hola, hola, and welcome to Latinas from the Block to the Boardroom. This is Theresa Gonzales, the founder and producer of this podcast, Latinas from the Block to the Boardroom. You know, at the beginning of 2023, I wanted to do a rewind and go back to the purpose of why I started this podcast. One of the reasons I started this podcast was the inequity that I saw in technology institutions, the two biggest platforms on the planet, which were Google and Facebook. I was a contract worker. I saw many contract workers there, many who were either people of color or they were older like myself. But we had the opportunity to work there, I want to say, as a second-class citizen. Now, many of you who follow understand that we are trying to change a dominant narrative in this community of color, our LGBTQ communities across the internet, and Latinas and women of color especially, of how we are represented in the interwebs. If you go into your search browser today, you can put in Latinas, you can put in business owner, and you can put those two together and see what comes up. If you just put in Latinas, you will see that there are images of us that are highly sexualized and objectifying us as women that want to be subservient, not powerful women, no leadership roles. But if you type in just businesswoman, you will see a lot of white women that come up in business roles as leaders. So when I talk about the dominant narrative that exists today in technology, why I started this podcast was because of that reason, of the dominant narrative that has been programmed for years into these search platforms that is indexed into the search criteria for our self-identification. Many of you will not believe this, but if you do it within your browser, you will see what I'm talking about. When we talk about inequity of wealth and the wealth gap that is existing within our communities, the digital divide, the access to capital for us to start our businesses, and how we want to represent our communities, it is all based on how we show up in these search platforms and how we are identified as women that are either low-wage workers, sex objects, or we just don't exist at all in these powerful positions, in positions of community champions, and also as women that want to change the narrative. This is why I started this podcast. Technology plays an important role in these narratives, and they should be held accountable. But as we know today, many are not. Some are taking action against them, and we can thank women of color for that, especially Black women that are taking and holding the helm in holding these platforms accountable. This podcast is to discuss how we can take back our identity to show the strong, powerful women and our communities, how we are smart, how we are self-sufficient, how we build community and businesses, and how we want to build into the next decade of technology. When I listen to this podcast, or if you hear it today, let us know how you can show up for us by supporting or telling your friends about this podcast, and how is all driven by technology. We hold the most powerful tool today in our hand, and that is the smartphone. And as more technology is introduced into our communities, I'm striving to build more digital literacy with our experiences and our voices. Again, I want everyone listening to understand that we don't have full control of our narratives today, and that needs to change. And how we show up in the interweb is really your support, your understanding of how we want to live and bring our families and our legacy into the new decades ahead. Gracias. And sí se puede. All right, welcome to Latinas on the Block to the Boardroom. Hey, everybody, I'm here at Podcast Movement 22 in Dallas, Texas. What an event from our last event in Los Angeles, where we were a booth sponsor representing Latinas that are podcasting in the space. So being here at Podcast Movement, we had the opportunity to speak on the society, culture, and advocacy track. And we were talking about AI and podcast advertising and how it's biased towards people of color. We had to explain the reasons why. We had a few people in the room, and it was magnificent. The room was so big, but we saw so many people that were elated of the information and the data points that we were bringing to them here at Podcast Movement. Although we wanted more people of color to show up and understand how we are being more biased in the algorithms that prevent us from capturing more clicks, more downloads for those campaigns that big brands want to spend big money on us. When we provided the data behind our identities in the interwebs, it was an eye-opening experience. My co-speaker, Noelle Silver, who was with me on the stage, who is an AI ethics leader in the space. She also is in charge of AI Leadership Institute. We were talking about our stories and connecting the dots of how our identities have been significantly oppressed in the interwebs just by saying Latinas, from saying Black women, from saying brown or Black people. And we gave those data facts on a slide, and people were just amazed that this was still happening in the year 2022. Now, why is this significant and why is this important? It's significant for the reason that here I am on the floor, the expo hall floor in Dallas here at the Sheraton, and everybody's talking about advertising. Everybody's talking about technology. Everyone's talking about how everybody can make more money if they just had the right technology, if they just had the right branding, if they had partnerships with big brands. How many downloads do you have? But we went below the surface. We went into showing folks how, if you put in the search term into Google, which we explained, Google and Facebook have made monoliths of money off of advertising. And if you put those into the search criteria, you'll see what comes up at the bottom of the page, which are very suggestive ads for women of color at the bottom. So once we demonstrated this, people's eyes were just fascinated that this was still happening in 2022. I gave them another example, how in 2019, when I was trying to search engine optimize, it's SEO, my podcast through a third-party website, which is integrated through Google, it brought up some very interesting terms, which I was showing on the screen. I put in empowerment words with the word Latina, and I said, give me the most optimized words that I can have on my website, Mr. Third-Party Integration SEO Optimizer, and show me what I can do to make my website more crawlable, where it's indexed to find people that are looking for my empowerment content and what I do and the services I provide to community. And they saw what I got back, which was dating Latinas, how to date a Latina, Latinas that dance. Boy, that was funny. And there were other ones. These were the criteria that integrated from a third-party search engine, AKA, you sit on top of Google, this is what it spits back out, right? So what was the conclusion to all of this? When I presented that information, I brought up another incident. It's actually a story from Los Angeles the podcast movement when I was at the booth. So I'm going to bring this up to speed here and just say that this gentleman who owns a company and they're a sponsor here at this podcast movement today, we shall protect the innocent and call him Barney. That's the term we're going to call him, is Barney. Barney says, Theresa, I'd like to help you. I want to help you. This is so awesome. And I'm like, okay, Barney, let's set up a call. Barney does call me. And he says, how do you run your campaigns today? Him, Barney, not knowing that I worked at Facebook and Google prior to these events. I know how the search engine works. I know how the advertising platforms work because I was on the analytics and the small business teams for Facebook and Google. So I'm just asking Barney the questions. Barney, how can you help me? Well, Theresa, here's how we can help. If you have $5,000, we can get you about 10,000 downloads a month so that you can hit your campaign numbers. I'm like, oh, wow, that's awesome. And he's like, and then you can attract the bigger brands that will give you more money to have ads on your podcast. Wow, Barney, that's awesome. So awesome. How does that work? Well, what we do is we buy programmatic space on other third-party sites. And I said, oh, wow, okay, got it. And I'm like, Barney, I have a couple of questions for you because, that sounds fantastic. Fantastic. This is a story I also gave on the stage yesterday. I said, Barney, that sounds fantastic. I really want that revenue, right, to support my podcast. I know they give thousands of dollars a month so that I can make that money back. Or they could sponsor my podcast and I can make that money and then I can support my team. So that's awesome. But you know what? I have a question. Yes? What is it, Theresa? Well, where do these ads get placed? Do you know? Like what websites or what platforms? Where does the ad actually get placed to get those downloads? And he's like, well, we have buyers and then they place them. And, we have success with other ads, from podcasters. He's giving me the examples. And I'm like, okay. And I'm like, well, my podcast, right? It says Latinas from the block to the boardroom. And he's like, oh, yeah. And I'm like, well, Barney, have you ever just put in Latinas into a search, into the search bar in Google or any other, search platform? And he's like, he paused for a minute and he's like, what do you mean? And I said, well, I'm not trying to tell you to do it now, but have you ever done it? And I wasn't trying to bust him, but he paused and he giggled for a minute. And I said, do you know that when you put that in, what comes up in the search criteria for you, especially? And he's like, no. And I said, well, on your free time, try it. And he's like, oh, I see what you mean. It's savory sites. You're afraid that they might be placed on savory sites. And I said, yes, exactly, Barney. Like that moment in Morpheus in the Matrix. And he says, yes, like you've just had an epiphany, right? You just had an epiphany. That is what hurts people of color in trying to self-identify using empowerment words to try to get their podcast elevated through advertising. We should not have to change our identity online. It is working against us with those suggestive ads. This is a part of the conversation we were having yesterday because more people of color are coming into the podcasting space. Younger folks that need to understand how these data sets were a foundational criteria to all of the search criteria that we now use across many platforms. Absolutely every single piece of technology is integrated through those search platforms. So when you come up with Latinas, Black women, brown and Black men that come up into the interwebs and you see what comes up at the bottom of the page, for these sexual ads or how to date Latinas, how to find hot Black women, all these things, that is not something of a criteria that was predicated from people of color. And this is how they make their money today. They have built billions of dollars in advertising. Mark Zuckerberg has even said, that's how we make our money, is advertising. Google, they are the biggest ads platform in the entire world. So when we are coming into this new space of telling our stories, of telling folks how we can improve our lives, how we can find better resources in our community, how we can elevate our careers, where we can find educational resources to go to college, to find our master's degree, how we can publish our books, all these things that come to us that we say, hey, let's get that out into the interwebs. It doesn't have to be so hard, but it is. And this is why, because of that foundational search criteria for people of color. So as I look out onto the expo floor and I see so many folks and the only little 20% of people of color, maybe less than that, and I want to help everybody here that wants to make money, that it becomes, there's equity in this space. So part of the solutions we have for this, we said, we're not angry, we just want to make it better. So how do we make it better? We have leadership teams that need to be accountable, or create advocacy leadership teams that actually are on these marketing teams that say, hey, ask the questions, right? Have your product teams look at the data to make sure that it's verifiable and not hurting the campaign. And also, why not just partner with the community to have them double check to make sure that it will have a successful campaign? I'm so grateful to be here at Podcast Movement and to share this information with you. Gracias. If you'd like to learn more about Latinas from the Block to the Boardroom and what we're doing, please subscribe to our newsletter at latinasb2b.com. And you can also send me an email at info@latinasb2b.com. Thank you for supporting this podcast. Sí se puede.